Hi all. So we're going to pick off where we left off last chapter. Remember in the last chapter we introduced some basic concepts of how a macroeconomy functions differently in the open economy. We mentioned key tools such as net capital outflow, which we noticed equaled exactly to net exports. And the reason why, right, was that net capital outflow was the purchase of foreign financial assets by domestic citizens minus the amount of domestic financial assets purchased by foreign citizens. And we also talked about purchasing power parity and real exchange rates, which basically got to the concept of how much is money worth and how does the value of money and its ability to purchase goods in other countries, how is equivalent across countries. Now we're going to take these tools and we're going to develop them into a more cohesive macroeconomic theory of the open economy. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to structure how supply and demand for financial goods and assets ultimately interact in a global economy and influence a economy's overall health. Now, supply and demand for loanable funds and for foreign currency exchange. Now, there's some initial assumptions that we make for an open economy and in constructing its model. These assumptions include things like GDP is a given, and it's defined by the economy's output of goods and services and is determined by its supplies of factors of production and by the available production technology. Now, a reminder, factors of production, right? These are things like land, labor, capital, and human capital. And by the available production technology, this is the idea that technology augments our ability to maximize our production from those factors of production. So again, let's think for a moment, why would this be fixed? Well, let's just take land, for example. Has the US landmass grown in 100 years? Not particularly. The land is pretty constant, right? So we can see why there's constraints on why GDP is fixed. Now, we'd introduce another concept, the market for loanable funds. We talked about this in chapter 16 and 17, right? And the market for loanable funds was simply where savers and borrowers interact to purchase and borrow or to save and borrow for the sake of investment. Now, the simplifying assumption here is that the financial system operates in a single market. That is the market for loanable funds. So basically, if you're borrowing in Georgia, or if you're borrowing in New York City, or if you're borrowing in California, or if you're investing in Idaho, all of these investments and savings interact in a single large aggregate market, which is the market for loanable funds. This is why savings rates are fairly constant no matter where you are in the country. Now, this includes all savings, i.e. the supply, and all borrowers, the demand. The price then is one single interest rate, which determines both the return to savers and the cost of borrowing. If you put your money in the bank account, right, the interest rate is your return on your saving. And if you borrow money, the interest rate you pay is your cost of borrowing. Now remember that one of the identities we discovered last chapter was that national savings is equivalent to investment plus net capital outflow. Supply and demand of loanable funds are then affected by the real interest rate, i.e. we said interest is the price for the supply and demand of loanable funds. But the reality is the real interest rate also affects net capital outflow. Higher interest rates make domestic debt more appealing to foreign countries, which decreases net capital outflow as foreign countries and foreign citizens purchase more domestic financial assets. Interest will adjust to bring supply and demand for loanable funds into equilibrium. This is an important note here. Again, we think of this as a general marketplace. The market of loanable funds acts much as a market that we talked about in chapter 4. It will establish equilibrium, or the price will interact to establish equilibrium. At the equilibrium interest rate, the amount that people want to save exactly balances the desired quantities of domestic investment and net capital outflow. So how does the market for loanable funds look? Well, let's consider two different markets. Notice on our left we have the domestic market, and on the right we have the FX market. So let's zoom in here and focus on the domestic market for one moment. So the domestic market for loanable funds, this is what we talked about in chapters 16 and 17. This is where we introduced simply the concept that savers are increasing the supply of loanable funds and investors are creating the demand for loanable funds, and the real interest rate governs them. In many ways, this looks exactly like any other market we've looked at, right? You have the supply, you have the demand, you have a price, in this case, the equilibrium real interest rate, and this leads to an equilibrium quantity. Now, where we see a wrinkle here is if we go over here and we look at the FX market, this is the market for foreign currency exchange. This is where American firms, when they sell goods abroad, take cash they've earned and convert it back into US dollars. So, for example, if you're in Japan and you sell a good in Japan, you're paid in Japanese yen. That doesn't do you much good if you need to spend that money in the US. So, in the FX market, you use that yen to purchase US dollars. Now, here's what's interesting. We find that the supply of dollars in this market is fixed. And the reason why is because this is the net capital outflow. However much money has been invested, or however much money Americans have purchased of foreign goods, is a fixed amount. It does not fluctuate or change based upon the real exchange rate. However, what does change upon the real exchange rate is the demand for dollars, which is from our net exports. So you might be like, wait, why is the demand for dollars driven by net exports and net capital outflow fixed as the supply? The answer is simply this. When you, again, let's go back to our example of a American firm selling a good in Japan. When they sell that good in Japan, they're paid in yen, and they then are trying to convert that cash back into US dollars. That desire to export the money received for exports back into US dollars, that's what stimulates the demand for dollars in the foreign exchange market. Now, where these two intersect, where the supply of dollars from net capital outflow and the demand for dollars intersect, this determines what we consider the equilibrium real exchange rate. Basically, the demand for US dollars from net exports, supply of net capital outflow, inform the value of a currency in FX markets, or in this case, inform the value of the United States dollar and its ability to purchase other currencies abroad. Now, continuing the market for foreign currency exchange, remember that net capital outflow equals net exports. So this states that the imbalance between capital outflows is equivalent to the imbalance in trade of goods and services. The price determining the demand for FX currency and its supply is again the real exchange rate. It does this by adjusting the attractiveness of domestic and foreign goods. A higher exchange rate means that your goods are domestic goods are more expensive compared to foreign goods, while a low exchange rate means that domestic goods are more attractive compared to foreign goods. So, what does this mean? When you have a high exchange rate like the United States does, this means your exports are more expensive for other countries to purchase relatively. Similarly, if a country has a low exchange rate, say like Japan does, this means their domestic goods or their exports are now more attractive compared to the goods in other markets. So why does this not affect net capital outflow? Because domestic firms still want to convert their foreign currency back into domestic currency. So there's an exception to this. Multinationals like Microsoft, which operate in multiple countries, they may want to turn around and hold on to that cash to develop operations further in those countries. However, most of the time, when a company sells currency or sells a good in another country, they want to take that currency and convert it back into US dollars. And this is what kind of keeps the net capital outflow and net exports in balance. Now, the equilibrium in the open economy is established through the net capital outflow. It's the link between the two markets. Net capital outflow links the market for foreign currency as well as the market for loanable funds. And the reason why is that, excuse me, the real interest rate affects demand in the market for loanable funds. Similarly, in the market for foreign currency, it determines the supply. And so net capital outflow, while it's affecting demand in the market for loanable funds, because again, think about this for one moment. What did we say net capital outflow was last chapter? Right. Investment plus net capital outflow equaled national savings. What we were saying there is that net capital outflow amounts to domestic savings in foreign assets. So, as it's a part of the market demand, then it's also determinant of the supply in the FX market. And the thing that determines net capital outflow, real interest rates. So if we zoom in here, what we see here is that when real interest rates go higher, right? So we have 0 point here marking basically our baseline for net capital outflow. When interest rates get higher, when real interest rates go up, we expect a negative capital outflow. And the reason we expect a negative capital outflow with higher real interest rates is because, again, we're saying that this good becomes more desirable to foreign countries. We're saying that foreign citizens look at a country with a higher real interest rate as a more desirable investment. However, if interest rates go down, we expect net capital outflow to be positive. And the reason why is that if interest rates are low in a country, we presume that one, citizens in that country looking for better interest rates will turn around and try to purchase interest rates in other or higher returning investments in other countries. Similarly, if a country has low interest rates, this typically means that it is less desirable for returns to foreigners, and so they also reduce their spending. So there's kind of a twofold trifecta here. With real high interest rates, the assets of a country are more desirable both to its individual citizens and also foreign countries, which both lead to a reduction in net capital outflow. However, with a lower real interest rate, basically what we see is that this incentivizes domestic citizens to look to foreign countries for higher returns, while incentivizing foreign investors to also look elsewhere. What this means is that when we combine all of these together, when we combine the market for loanable funds with net capital outflow with the FX market, we can see clearly now how a adjustment in the real interest rate leads to supply of funds in the FX market. So notice here, the equilibrium real interest rate at R1, where the supply of loanable funds equals the demand for loanable funds, intersect, we trace this over, it determines the real interest rate for the net capital outflow market. And the net capital outflow market is then determined again by the real interest rate. So as real interest rate is higher, this would lead to, again, a reduction in net capital outflow, while decreased interest rates would lead to increased rates of net capital outflow. And then from there, from the point that we see the real interest rate determine net capital outflow, we can trace it downward to determine the supply of funds in the FX market. And where the supply of funds, as determined by the net capital outflow, it occurs in the FX market, where demand intersects it determines our real exchange rate. So, how do policies and events affect an open economy? Well, government budget deficits can ultimately affect the market for loanable funds by decreasing the amount of loanable funds available or leading to negative savings. So since the deficit amounts to negative savings, national savings is reduced overall. Therefore, a government budget deficit reduces the supply of loanable funds. Now, again, why does it work this way? Because if a government runs a budget deficit, that means it's spending more than it's bringing in taxes. If it's bringing in more than it's spending in taxes, it has to then borrow from the private sector in order to cover its debts. When it borrows from the private sector to cover its debts, this reduces the supply of loanable funds. In open economies, budget deficits raise real interest rates, crowding out domestic investment, causing the currency to appreciate and push the trade balance toward deficits. Now, this is what we call the twin deficits, a trade deficit and a budget deficit. And this is one of the things that plugged the macroeconomy in the 1980s, particularly in the United States. So a trade deficit is, again, you are running a deficit trade-wise, you are importing more than you are exporting, and you're also running a budget deficit, with the budget deficit being that you are spending more, the government is spending more than it is bringing in tax-wise. Now, graphically, we can see what the consequences of this look like. If we look here for the market of loanable funds, A is our original equilibrium point. This is where the demand and the supply intersect. However, with a budget deficit, the government has to borrow from the private market, thereby leading to a leftward shift in the supply of loanable funds. With this leftward shift in the supply of loanable funds, we establish a new intersection at point B, where we have a higher real interest rate and a lower quantity of loanable funds. But with this higher real interest rate, if we trace this over to our net capital outflow market, this higher real interest rate reduces net capital outflow. And remember, again, what happens here is that with a higher real interest rate, we are incentivizing foreign individuals to purchase domestic assets, and we are incentivizing domestic citizens to purchase less foreign assets. Ultimately, what this means is that we trace over to a leftward shift in the supply of net capital a leftward shift in the supply of dollars in the FX market as well. So there's a decrease in the net capital outflow, which reduces the supply of dollars to be exchanged in foreign currency. When foreign currency exchanges drop, this leftward shift ultimately means that we then have a real higher exchange rate. So notice we shift from S1 to S2. S2 intersects the demand curve at a higher real exchange rate. What does this mean? Well, the higher real exchange rate tells us that the exports have gone down. So this this sequence of graphing basically informs us that with a increase in government spending, there's a reduction in the market for loanable funds, which drives up higher interest rates, which leads to reduced net capital outflow, which decreases the amount of dollars, the supply of dollars in the FX market, which leads to a higher real exchange rate, causing a currency to appreciate and ultimately leading to a reduction in exports. It's a lot, right? But that's kind of why we've been building this class think of it like Lego pieces. We've been working through gradually and slowly ways to build together and assemble these graphs to understand bigger policies and the implication of policy options. Now, there's other things government have at its disposal. For example, trade policy. Trade policy is a government policy that directly influences the quantity of goods and services that country imports or exports. Now, a tariff, for example, is a tax on imported goods. This is a specific government policy they could use for trade. Additionally, you have an import quota, which is a cap on the amount of an item that can be imported. Now, the effects of an import quota we can model on the right to see a graph, and it's going to show us a surprising implication. And that surprising implication is that trade policies do not affect the trade balance because they do not alter national saving or domestic investment. So if we look over here at the market for loanable funds, we find our real interest rate is determined by the supply and demand intersection, which traces over to determine our net capital outflow, which in turn traces our supply in the domestic market, or which traces our supply in the foreign exchange market. I apologize. So with supply fixed to the foreign exchange market, if we introduce something like an import quota, something which is intentionally meant to drive up the net export balance, or exports, is that we find that ultimately this leads to a increase in the demand for dollars because again there's a reduction in imports, meaning that there are not as many individuals trying to convert their cash back into another kind of currency. So what this means is disproportionately domestic producers trying to convert their cash back into dollars leads to a shift in the demand. But ultimately, all we find here is that instead of an increase in supply, we just wind up with a higher real exchange rate. So ultimately, what we see here is an import quota does not redress the trade balance. It does not improve net exports. In fact, all it ends up doing is rebalancing it through reducing net exports through a higher real exchange rate. Now, a final situation to consider is political instability and capital flight. Capital flight is a large and sudden reduction in the demand for assets located in a country. Often, this is a response to political instability and individuals shifting their assets to more stable countries. This is where you get the concept of things like safe havens or the Swiss bank account cliche. Basically, if a country suffers from turmoil or political turmoil or a lot of uncertainty, individuals will try to put their money somewhere that it is deemed safe and stable. So, for example, Venezuela is going through an economic crisis. Similarly, Argentina has gone through an economic crisis. If you are middle class or wealthy in these countries, what do? You want to find somewhere that your cash will be safe rather than the risk of confiscation, rather the risk of civil war, rather the risk of uprising. So what do? You send your cash abroad and you store it abroad to protect the value of that money. Now, similarly, foreigners that own assets in those countries similarly withdraw cash suddenly. They don't want assets either, right? They're trying to retreat, pull back cash, and they're trying to move it to somewhere that it's also safe. So what we find here is that the consequence of capital flight is that it increases domestic interest rates and decreases the value of the domestic currency in the market for foreign currency exchange. And ultimately what that means is that this is a double-fisted attack on the financial and monetary health of a country. And again, this is the risk of political instability. So notice see what happens here. In our market for loanable funds in Mexico, so Mexico had a similar situation over the course of the 90s, early 2000s. So in the event of a capital flight, what you find is there an increase in the demand for loanable funds. And the reason there's a decrease in the demand for loanable funds is from this increase in net capital outflow brought on by fears of uncertainty. So again, let's see here. First step is our increase in net capital outflow. So we have this rightward shift again from fear of a panic. If net capital outflow, remember, if net capital outflow is our domestic savings in foreign assets, then that means the demand for loanable funds has also increased and shifted rightward. The rightward shift in demand corresponds to a new equilibrium interest rate that was higher than the original interest rate. So we've moved from this point to this point with a new shift. But ultimately, this creates another feedback. If the increase in net capital outflow led to an increase in the demand in the domestic market, leads to a higher real interest rate. Well, a higher real interest rate then also leads to a higher net capital outflow. Or, sorry, I apologize. A higher real interest rate then reduces the net capital outflow from where it was at originally, but ultimately still leads to an increase in the supply of net capital outflow in the FX market. So to explain what happened here, if we were at the original interest rate, right, and we connected here, we'd find that net capital outflow intersects at a higher point. So we'd expect an increase in net capital outflow at the same interest rate due to this outflow. However, the real interest rate increase, which comes from the shift in demand, leads to a reduction in the net capital outflow from where it was at the shifted point at the original interest rate to a higher interest rate, which means there's lower net capital outflow than after the initial shift, but still higher than the original interest rate and net capital outflow. What this means is with a higher net capital outflow, the intersection for the demand and the supply of funds or the supply of money in the FX market is increased as well, meaning that the currency is going to depreciate. So basically, there's several steps here actually that shows us that in a event of political instability and capital flight, a tough situation can turn even more disastrous when higher interest rates make it more difficult to obtain currency, and higher interest rates also then lead to, and while simultaneously us finding ourselves with a weaker currency. To conclude, this has again been a basic setup and introduction to open macroeconomic theory. We've been talking about how we've connected concepts and ideas that we've been talking about since chapter 10, right? You're seeing GDP integrated into the monetary market, integrated into foreign exchange markets. And we're starting to create models which allow us to interpret very complex real political challenges and economic issues. The exciting thing here is this isn't the end. In our next section, in our final section of the text, we're actually going to get into constructing a model for how macroeconomies fluctuate. And we're going to study business cycles. And we're going to see how the tools we have built up to this point allow us to explain such complicated issues as the Great Depression, the Great Recession, and other economic crises. All right, I hope you enjoyed. And until next time, take care all.